There's a moment, and I think most people who have lived through something truly historic know exactly what I'm talking about. There's a moment right before everything changes where the air goes quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Wrong quiet. The kind of quiet where your body knows something your brain hasn't caught up to yet. I felt that quiet on Vethara Station the day humanity walked away. I was standing on level 7, observation ring C, eating a tube of reconstituted noodles that tasted like cardboard soaked in someone's memory of chicken broth, watching the stars drift past the viewport like they always did. Slow, indifferent, beautiful in that cold, unreachable way they always are when you're feeling small. And then the announcement came through the station comm. Not the official one. Not the Galactic Assembly's polished synthetic voice reading prepared statements in 17 languages. No, the real announcement came from Kessel, who worked 3 rings down in the Human Diplomatic Liaison office. She sent it through our private channel, the one we'd set up using a signal splice that technically violated Vethara's communication protocols and technically nobody cared about. She just said 3 words. They voted yes. That was it. 3 words. And somehow I already knew that everything I'd watched humans build out here in the cold dark between stars, every handshake, every treaty, every patrol shift, every piece of equipment we'd contributed, every soldier we'd buried on foreign soil that wasn't even soil, all of it was about to be handed back. Unsigned. Unacknowledged. Returned like a gift nobody wanted. Let me back up because if I'm going to tell this right, I need to give you the picture. The full picture. Not the sanitized version the Assembly's press office pushed out and not the bitter human nationalist version either. Just what I saw, what I know, what I lived. My name is Rael Oduya. I was, I suppose, though the title feels strange now, a second-tier civilian observer attached to the Terran diplomatic envoy stationed aboard Vethara Station, which is, or was, the central hub of the Galactic Assembly's Third Arm operations. Third Arm covers about 46 inhabited systems, 7 major trade lanes, and roughly 400 billion sentient beings of various shapes and temperaments. I'd been there 4 years. 4 years of watching diplomats smile at each other with all their various mouths and eyes and sensory organs. 4 years of translating not just language but intent. 4 years of sitting in rooms where humanity was always the newest arrival, always the species that hadn't quite proven itself yet, always the one that got the chairs that were slightly too small because nobody had thought to order the right size. Small things, but small things have a way of telling you everything. Humanity had joined the Galactic Assembly 11 years before that day. 11 years of integration, cooperation, and what everyone called the Great Alignment, the period where Earth species, Homo sapiens, those stubborn, loud, endlessly creative and occasionally catastrophic bipeds, worked themselves into the fabric of galactic civilization with the same energy they'd always applied to everything. Which is to say, completely, obsessively, with total disregard for their own limitations. We'd sent soldiers to 3 separate conflicts that had nothing to do with Earth. We'd provided medical teams to the Sarathi plague response when the Assembly's own health corps was overwhelmed. We'd built relay stations in systems so remote that the construction crews lived 6 months in transit each way. We'd sent engineers, diplomats, artists, teachers, scientists, a tidal wave of human presence and human effort. And we'd done it, genuinely, because we believed in what the Assembly stood for. Or at least, we believed in what we thought it stood for. The Murak Exclusion Act changed that. The Murak were, I should say, humanity's closest allies within the Assembly, not because of cultural similarity. The Murak looked like something between a deep-sea creature and an architectural blueprint, all angular fluid-filled chambers and bioluminescent communication patches. Nothing about them maps easily onto human aesthetics. but they'd been the first species to vote for Earth's membership. They'd been the ones who argued, loudly and persistently in assembly chambers, that humanity deserved a seat at the table. Their ambassador, Vailsoth, had given a speech during Earth's induction ceremony that humans still quoted. Something about how species that had survived their own capacity for destruction and still chosen to reach outward were exactly the species a galaxy needed. The Murak had been good friends, which is why what the assembly did to them was so hard to watch. I won't get into every political nuance of the Sarathi corridor dispute. It's complicated. It involves resource rights and ancient territorial claims, and about 900 years of grievances that predate humanity's awareness that other stars had planets. But the short version is this. The Murak had held a section of contested space for generations. The hegemony of Vor, a block of 3 species with significantly more political weight in the assembly, wanted it. Not because they needed it, because having it would shift the balance of the third arm economic structure in their favor by a margin that translated, in human terms, to approximately the GDP of a mid-sized country. The Assembly voted on the Murak Exclusion Act, a legal mechanism to strip the Murak of their territorial claim, and it passed. 12 voting blocs voted yes. 3 voted no. Humanity was one of the 3. We'd argued against it for 9 months before the vote. Our diplomats had presented evidence, proposed compromises, requested delays, done everything short of physically blocking the chamber doors. Ambassador Chen Vasquez had given a speech that, I was told, made 2 of the Sarathi delegates visibly uncomfortable, which for them is the equivalent of breaking down crying. It didn't matter. The vote passed. The Murak lost their territory, and then, because the hegemony of Vor wanted to make sure there were no lingering complications, they pushed through a secondary motion to limit Murak representation in assembly proceedings for a period of 30 years, pending diplomatic remediation. 30 years. The Murak had been in the assembly for 400. And when our ambassador stood up to formally register humanity's objection, the response from the hegemony's lead delegate, a creature called Var Kaseth, who I had privately nicknamed the Architectural Grudge, because of the way it seemed to be constructed entirely from old resentments, was to say, and I have this on the record because I was transcribing in real time, that humanity's objection was noted and filed, consistent with your species' status as provisional members. Provisional. After 11 years. After 3 conflicts and a plague response, and 400 relay stations. Provisional. I remember writing that word into my transcription, and then just staring at it for a while. Commander Yara Osaimensa was the one who explained to me what the word actually meant in the political context, and she did it the way she explained most things. Standing in the corridor outside the liaison office, arms crossed, talking to the wall somewhere to my left rather than at me directly. Yara was the head of the Terran security detachment aboard Vethara, 22 soldiers, 3 specialists, and 1 medic who was also, somehow, an accomplished competitive chess player. The detachment was there officially to protect the diplomatic mission. Unofficially, they were there because the Assembly had a particular rule that any member species diplomatic station required a minimum security complement to maintain full member status protocols, which was another one of those small things that told you everything. The rule existed because somewhere, at some point, a species powerful enough to write rules had decided to write a rule that would require other species to maintain expensive, complicated military presences far from home just to stay seated at the table. Yara had been here 3 years. She had the kind of stillness that soldiers develop when they've been in enough situations where moving wrong gets people killed. Not cold stillness, controlled stillness. She was also, for what it's worth, one of the funniest people I've ever met, though you'd never know it until she decided you were safe to laugh with. Provisional means we're on a timer, she said. Has nothing to do with 11 years, has everything to do with the vote count. We went against the hegemony, now we're being measured. Measured for what? Whether we're useful enough to keep around, or difficult enough to remove. She said it the same way she said everything, flat, factual, without drama. And what do you think they'll decide? She finally looked at me. I think, she said, they made a mistake when they let us in, and I think they're starting to figure that out. She didn't mean it as a threat. She was just being honest. Humans had been useful in specific, controlled ways. But the thing about humans, the thing that had made every single prior observer in assembly history note, with varying degrees of alarm, that humanity was difficult to integrate, was that we had a persistent and apparently unshakable habit of caring about things that weren't technically our problem. The Merak situation wasn't technically our problem. We cared anyway. And in a galaxy run by very old species who had spent centuries learning which problems to care about and which to file away, that particular human trait was not, it turned out, an asset. It was a liability. The weeks after the Merak vote were strange in the way that everything is strange when something has broken, but nobody's acknowledged it yet. The liaison office kept operating, diplomatic schedules kept running. I kept attending briefings and writing transcriptions, and eating my terrible reconstituted noodles, and watching the stars through the viewport on level 7. But there was a texture to it now, like a sound in a wall you can't quite locate. Ambassador Chen Vasquez started holding more closed-door meetings. Her assistant, a young man named Dmitri who'd been so enthusiastic when he arrived that people had quietly worried about him, stopped being enthusiastic. Yara's security team started running drills at hours when the station's common areas were less crowded. Not suspicious drills, just drills. And the other delegations started behaving differently toward us. Not dramatically, nothing you could point to and say that's the thing. Just a shift in the ambient temperature of every interaction. The Sarathi delegates, who'd previously been correct and occasionally even warm in a four-mouthed way, started finding reasons to be busy when human representatives requested meetings. The Velkorath trade liaison, with whom we'd been building what felt like a genuine working relationship over shared interest in certain agricultural technologies, stopped returning messages. And the hegemony of Varkaseth and its entourage started showing up in places they hadn't been before, not confrontationally, just present, in corridors, in observation areas, at the edges of spaces where humans gathered. Watching. I reported all of this. I documented it carefully in the observer logs that went back to Earth on the secure weekly transmission. And Earth responded, as it always did, with measured acknowledgement and a request for continued documentation. Which is the diplomatic equivalent of keep going, we're watching, we're not sure what to do yet. The formal complaint arrived on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate because Tuesdays have always seemed to me like the day of the week, with the least reason to feel optimistic about anything. It came from the hegemony of Vor, submitted through the Assembly's Diplomatic Conduct Review Board, and it alleged that the Terran diplomatic mission had, quote, engaged in conduct inconsistent with provisional member standards through unauthorized advocacy on behalf of a disciplined member species, constituting interference in assembly adjudication processes. Unauthorized advocacy. We'd voted no on a motion. We'd given speeches in a public chamber. We'd followed every procedure exactly as specified. Unauthorized advocacy. The complaint requested a formal review, a temporary suspension of Terran voting rights pending that review, and a reduction in the Terran security detachment to observation-only status, which was a polite way of saying our soldiers would no longer have the authority to carry weapons in common areas. I read it 3 times. Then I went and found Yara. She was in the small gym the security team had set up in one of the storage areas on level 5, doing pull-ups on a bar she'd bolted to a support beam. She did them the way she did everything, steadily, without apparent effort, counting quietly. I showed her the complaint on my tablet. She finished her set, dropped down, read it. "How long before the review?" she asked. 60 days, standard timeline. But they can fast-track it. They'll fast-track it. Probably. She handed the tablet back. "How's Ambassador Chen Vasquez taking it?" "I haven't seen her yet. Dimitri said she's been in her office since the transmission came in." Yara nodded. She picked up a water bottle and drank from it, and then stood there looking at the pull-up bar. "You know what's funny?" she said. Not like it was actually funny, like it was the opposite of funny. "When I was a kid, I used to read these old science fiction stories about humanity joining an alien civilization. And in every one of them, every single one, the question was whether aliens would be aggressive, whether they'd try to conquer us or ignore us or be afraid of us." She paused. "Nobody ever wrote the story where they'd just be bureaucratic about it. That's the scariest version, actually." "Yeah," she said, "it kind of is." 60 days became 30 yet. They fast-tracked it. The review board's preliminary finding was released on a morning when Vithara Station was passing through a dust-scatter region, and the whole viewport was amber and slightly hazy, like looking through old glass. I remember because I was in the observation ring when the notification hit, and I stood there reading it against that amber backdrop, and the dissonance of it felt almost theatrical. Like the universe had arranged the lighting specifically to underline how wrong this was. The preliminary finding upheld the complaint. Terran voting rights suspended for 90 days pending full review. Security detachment restricted to protected diplomatic areas only. Ambassador Chen Vasquez to provide formal testimony before the review board within 2 weeks. And one additional item, almost buried in the procedural language at the bottom. Terran relay stations in the outer 7 stations we'd built, staffed with our own people, maintained at our expense in systems so remote that supply runs were nightmares, were to be temporarily administered by hegemony operational staff to ensure continuity of assembly communications infrastructure during the review period. Temporarily. I stared at that word for a long time. Temporarily. I thought about the crews who'd built those stations. The engineers who'd spent 6 months in transit each way, living in ships designed for the comfortable accommodation of species that breathe different air in different ratios. The maintenance techs who'd spent years rotating through postings that were genuinely, brutally isolated. I thought about Corporal Emeka Adiz, who I'd met briefly during a station tour 18 months ago, who'd shown me photos of a son he hadn't seen in 2 years and talked about how the job felt important even though nobody really talked about it. Temporarily administered. I went to Yara. "They want the stations," she said before I could explain what I'd read. She'd already seen it. "They've always wanted the stations. That's what this is." The complaint, the review, is the mechanism. She wasn't angry. She was past angry into something quieter and harder. They couldn't just take them. We built them, they're technically ours, so they create a process, a legitimate, procedurally correct process, and at the end of it somehow the stations are under hegemony operational control. She looked at me. Give it 6 months. The temporary administration becomes standard. Standard becomes permanent. And nobody did anything wrong because every step was technically correct. I thought about what she'd said earlier about bureaucracy being the scariest version. "What do we do?" I asked. And for the first time since I'd known her, Yara Osimensa didn't immediately have an answer. She just stood there in that controlled stillness of hers, and I could see her working something through, turning it over, checking it from every angle. Finally she said, "That's going to be Ambassador Chen Vasquez's call, not mine." "And what do you think she'll decide?" She looked at me with something I can only describe as clear-eyed sadness. "I think," she said slowly, "that she's going to decide that there's nothing left to protect here." The meeting happened that night. I know what was said in it because I was part of it. Civilian observers attend executive diplomatic sessions. That's the protocol. But I also know that what happened in that room is not what got reported to the public, by us or by anyone else, for a long time afterward. There were 11 of us in the room. Ambassador Chen Vasquez at the head of the table, Yara standing to one side, 3 senior diplomatic staff, 2 specialists from the liaison office, myself, and 2 others whose names I'll leave out because they've moved on and this isn't their story to be in. Ambassador Chen Vasquez looked tired in a specific way that I associate with people who have been right about something for a long time without anyone listening. She had a thin folder in front of her that she didn't open. She just looked around the table. "I've been on the channel with Earth for 3 hours, she said. "I want to share what we discussed, and then I want to hear from each of you." She laid it out clearly. The legal position, the political reality, the timeline, the options. The legal position was, the complaint was procedurally valid even if it was substantively dishonest. The Assembly's conduct review processes had been designed by species that had spent centuries perfecting the art of using procedure as a weapon, and every mechanism we might use to challenge it was itself subject to review by the same board that had issued the complaint. The political reality was, the 12 blocs that had voted for the MUREC Exclusion Act were aligned. We had 2 solid allies, the MUREC themselves, for all that was worth given their current restricted status, and the Keth Collective, who were principled but small. 3 blocs were genuinely undecided. 6 were watching to see which way the wind blew. The timeline was, the full review process could take 2 years. During those 2 years, our voting rights would remain suspended, our security detachment would remain restricted, and the outer 7 stations would remain under temporary hegemony administration. The options were what they always are when you've been maneuvered into a corner by people who are better at the game than you are. You could fight within the system and probably lose. You could appeal to outside pressure and find there was none. Or you could walk. Earth, she said, has authorized withdrawal. The room was quiet. Not shocked quiet, processing quiet. The kind of quiet that means everyone already felt this coming and is now standing at the edge of accepting it. "The option has been authorized," she continued. "It has not been mandated. The decision is mine to make, with your input." She opened the floor. What followed was the most honest conversation I have ever participated in. There was no posturing. There were no diplomatic performances. People said what they actually thought, including things that were uncomfortable, and things that contradicted each other, and things that I don't think any of us would have said in any other room. One of the senior diplomats, Vance, who'd been in interstellar service for 20 years, said he thought withdrawal was a mistake. Not because the Assembly deserved our presence, but because leaving would cede influence permanently. "The MUREC didn't leave," he said. "They stayed and took the punishment and waited." "Maybe that's the play." Yara said, "The MUREC stayed because they had nowhere to go. We have Earth." Dmitri, who surprised everyone by speaking, said, "We've been provisional for 11 years. At what point does provisional stop being a status and start being a message?" Nobody had a good answer to that. I said what I thought, because the ambassador had asked for honest input, and I was tired of the weight of documentation without contribution. I said, "The stations are the tell. They don't want us to fight and lose within the system. They want us to stay and be diminished. A managed decline. Slowly walking us back from everything we contributed until we're present enough to be used but not powerful enough to object." Chen Vasquez looked at me for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "That's what I think too." Then she was quiet for another while. The argument for staying is about future influence, she finally said. The argument for leaving is about present dignity. She looked around the table. I've been doing this work for 18 years. I got into it because I believed that the right kind of presence changes things. That being at the table, even uncomfortably, matters. A pause. I still believe that, but I think there's a version of being at the table that isn't presence. It's decoration, and I won't turn our people into decoration. She closed the folder. We're going home. What happened next is both complicated and simple, depending on how close you were standing. From a distance, what happened was this. The Terran diplomatic mission formally notified the Galactic Assembly that humanity was withdrawing from membership, effective immediately, pending a 30-day administrative transition period. The notification was submitted through proper channels, using the correct forms, following the correct procedures, because humans are relentlessly correct about procedures even when the procedures have been weaponized against them. The official statement, which Ambassador Chen Vasquez wrote herself and did not allow anyone to soften, said, "The Terran diplomatic mission has concluded that the Galactic Assembly's current structure does not provide conditions under which Earth's membership can be exercised in good faith. We wish the Assembly's member species well and look forward to future opportunities for cooperation in contexts that respect the contributions and standing of all parties." That was it. No anger, no accusations, no list of grievances. Just a polite, precise statement that said everything by saying almost nothing. The Assembly's initial response was, I'm told, a combination of bureaucratic processing and something that might have been described, in the right species, as surprise. But you'd have to know the Var-Kaseth delegation well to read it that way. They were not a species that showed surprise easily. But I wasn't watching the Assembly's response. I was watching what happened on Vithara Station itself. The 30-day transition period was when I understood, really understood, what we were to this place. I spent most of it doing logistics, observer logs to be archived, equipment to be cataloged, personnel files to be updated, the 10,000 small administrative tasks that fill the space between a decision and its execution. But I also walked the station. I did it deliberately. I wanted to see it. I wanted to have seen it. Vithara Station was extraordinary. I don't want to diminish that. The central hub alone was 6 kilometers in diameter, a slowly rotating construction of layered decks and pressurized sections and environmental zones that could sustain 47 different atmospheric requirements simultaneously. The observation rings gave you views that no planet-bound existence can replicate, the cold, star-scattered dark in every direction, occasionally lit by the slow passage of ships that ranged in size from human scale to things the size of small moons. For 11 years, humans had moved through this place, had worked here, lived here, formed friendships and professional relationships, and occasionally, I suspected, romances that the diplomatic code strongly discouraged, had eaten their reconstituted noodles and complained about the chairs and fixed equipment that wasn't theirs to fix and shown up for conflicts that weren't theirs to die in. And I walked through it all, and I watched the other species watch us. Not all of them were indifferent, that's important to say. The Keth Collective's small diplomatic team, 4 individuals, quiet and methodical, who communicated partly through color shifts in their outer membranes, came to our section in person to express what I can only describe as genuine grief. The Murek ambassador, Vale Soth, sent a private communication to Chen Vasquez that I was not supposed to see and did see, which said, among other things, "You are the 3rd species in 4 centuries to choose dignity over accommodation. I am sorry that this is not the victory it should be." Others were less gracious. The Sarathi delegation passed our section twice during the transition period, both times without stopping, without acknowledgement. The second time, one of their junior attachés, young, probably new to station posting, hesitated slightly as she passed our door, like she thought about stopping, then kept walking. I don't know what she would have said. I've thought about it since. Varkaseth I saw only once. It was on level 4, near the trade liaison offices, and I was there to retrieve some documentation, and it was there for reasons I don't know. We passed each other in the corridor. Wide corridor, plenty of room. Varkaseth was taller than most humans, and it moved with the particular gait of its species, slow, deliberate, each movement freighted with the confidence of something that had existed for a very long time and expected to continue existing. It looked at me as we passed. Or rather, the sensory organs that functioned as eyes in its species directed themselves at me as we passed. I looked back. Neither of us said anything. It kept walking. I kept walking. That was the whole of it. But I thought about what Yara had said, about species that had spent centuries learning which problems to care about and which to file away. And I thought, here is an entity that is very, very good at that skill, and for a moment I pitied it, which surprised me, because pity was not the emotion I'd have expected to feel. Yara's detachment was the last to leave. Protocol. The security team stays until the diplomatic mission is fully evacuated, then leaves together. It's the kind of rule that was designed for dangerous situations, sieges, evacuations under fire, that kind of thing. Here it just meant that Yara and 22 soldiers and 3 specialists, and a chess champion medic, were the last humans on Vethara Station. I was supposed to be on the second-to-last transport. I ended up on the last one, because I am constitutionally incapable of leaving a situation before I've seen how it ends, which is probably why I became an observer in the first place. So I was there. The departure bay was on level 2, close to the station's outer hull. The transport was a Terran ship, a mid-sized diplomatic carrier called the Abuja, which I'd traveled on twice before, and which always smelled faintly of the industrial cleaner its maintenance crew used, and which had a small common room with a real window, rather than a viewport and a coffee maker that actually worked most of the time. The detachment came through the departure bay in standard formation, not parade formation, not ceremonial anything, just the practical walking through a space formation of people who had trained together long enough that their movements rhymed without effort. Yara at the front, 22 soldiers, 3 specialists, Dr. Nkechayadanya, the chess champion medic, at the rear. They were in uniform, not combat gear, not dress uniform, working uniform. The kind of thing you wear when you have a job to do, and the job requires looking like yourself. And here is the thing I want to describe carefully, because I don't think I've ever described it to anyone adequately, and I want to get it right at least once. As the detachment walked through level 2 toward the departure bay, the station knew they were leaving. I don't mean that poetically. I mean that somehow, through whatever communication networks existed in Vethara's various diplomatic communities, word had gotten out, and people had come to watch. Not a crowd, not a gathering, just presences, species that I recognized and some I didn't, stationed at various points along the level 2 corridor in small groups or alone, watching. Most of them said nothing. Some of the Keth were there. 2 of them. Their membrane coloring was doing something I hadn't seen before, a slow cycle through shades that, in context, I interpreted as something like grief, though I could be wrong. They didn't speak, but as the detachment passed, they shifted toward the wall slightly, in a gesture that I'd come to understand over 4 years was their closest equivalent to a respectful bow. The detachment didn't stop, but they noticed. I saw it in how Yara's chin lifted slightly, just slightly. There were others. A Murak junior diplomat who pressed a bioluminescent pattern against her communication patch as we passed. I didn't have time to read it, but the color suggested something like remembered. A pair of maintenance workers from a species I didn't recognize who simply stopped what they were doing and stood still. What there wasn't, conspicuously, was any representative of the hegemony of Vor. No Sarathi senior staff. Nobody from the 12 blocks. They were elsewhere on the station, occupied with the ongoing work of the assembly, and they did not come to watch humanity leave. We walked through the station in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, not the wrong quiet from the beginning of this. Something else. Something that felt, in a way I struggled to articulate, like being heard after a long time of not being heard. The departure bay had 4 other people in it when we arrived. 3 Vethara technical staff handling the docking protocols, and Vale Soth. The Murak ambassador was standing near the airlock, standing in the loose, partially inflated way of Murak at rest, and when Yara reached the front of the bay, Vale Soth moved toward her. Not quickly, but directly. They stopped in front of each other. Vale Soth's bioluminescent patches ran through several patterns. I caught most of it. It said, translated loosely, "You came when we needed. You stayed when it was difficult. You leave with your honor intact. This will be remembered even when it is inconvenient to remember." Yara listened. She wasn't a species that communicated in bioluminescent patches, so she responded in speech, which gets automatically translated through the station system. She said, "Take care of yourselves, and give us a call when things change." Not if when. Vale Soth held the eye-equivalent gaze for a moment, then made the Murak gesture of parting, which I will not try to describe because it doesn't translate to human description, and I'd rather leave it as what it was than reduce it to an approximation. Then the detachment went through the airlock and onto the Abuja, and I followed them, and the airlock sealed behind us. The Abuja undocked cleanly. I was in the common room with the real window when it happened, and I watched Vethara Station pull away from us, or us from it, depending on your frame of reference, and it was exactly as large and extraordinary as it always was. 6 kilometers of rotating structure, lit from within, hung against the cold dark like something between a cathedral and a machine. Yara came in and stood next to me. We watched for a while. "How are you doing?" I asked, which was a ridiculous question but seemed necessary. "I'm okay," she said, then, "ask me again in a week." Fair enough. We were quiet. Then she said, looking at the station, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "Those relay stations, the outer 7. She was very still. "We built those in places nobody else wanted to go, in systems that the assembly had classified as non-priority. We went there because we thought being useful mattered, because we thought the shape of what you contribute eventually becomes the shape of your standing." She paused. "We were right," she said, "just not in the way we thought. We built infrastructure that was valuable. That's why they took it." I thought about that. "Do you think they'll regret it?" I asked. "Eventually." She considered. "Yes," she said, "I think they'll regret it." Not angrily, just honestly. Not right away, maybe not for years, but one day something will happen, some crisis, some conflict, some plague or disaster or system failure in a place that nobody else wanted to go, and they'll reach for us. And we won't be there. She looked at me. "And on that day," she said, "I think the silence will be very loud." The Abuja cleared the last of Vethara's traffic patterns 16 hours after departure and engaged its main drive. There's a moment, when a ship goes to primary thrust, where the light from wherever you've been stretches for just a second before the distance becomes too great for that kind of mathematics. A last visual reach backward. I watched it. And then Vethara Station was a point of light like any other. And then it was less than that. And then the dark between us was the kind of dark that doesn't carry sound or regret or the weight of what's been. Just stars. Cold, indifferent, beautiful. We were going home. The galaxy, I think, did not immediately understand what it had done. That's the honest answer. There was no dramatic moment of recognition. No hegemony assembly session where Varkaseth stood up and said, "We've made an error." Life on Vethara continued. The assembly met. Votes were taken. Trade routes operated. The mechanisms of galactic civilization turned, as they always had, slowly and enormously, like something too large to feel the small losses in its teeth. For 18 months, humanity was simply absent. Earth did what Earth does when it decides something. It redirected its energy. The diplomatic budget that had gone to Vethara went to bilateral agreements with species who'd always been outside the Assembly's orbit. The engineers who'd built the Outer Seven built 3 new stations in systems that Earth controlled directly. The soldiers who'd been in the detachment went to other posts or came home, and some of them talked about what they'd seen, and some of them didn't. I went home, I wrote. I observed from a different vantage point, which is, in some ways, the most honest vantage point. And I watched what happened. The Kethvar crisis happened 14 months after withdrawal. I won't pretend I predicted it. Nobody predicted it. The Kethvar system was one of the Outer Seven, one of the relay stations we'd built, that the hegemony had taken under temporary administration during the review process. The crisis involved a biological contamination in the local system shipping lanes, which activated through a specific electromagnetic interaction with the kind of signal relay equipment that the hegemony's operational staff had, it turned out, been running differently from how we designed it to be run. Not maliciously, just differently. The way you run equipment you didn't build and don't entirely understand. The contamination spread through 6 ships before anyone realized what was happening. The hegemony's crisis response teams were good. They're old enough to have developed good crisis response teams. But the contamination interacted badly with the specific atmospheric chemistry of the species crewing those ships, and the medical protocols that the hegemony's systems recommended were designed for different biochemistries. The Assembly's Emergency Medical Coordination Center reached out to 16 species for assistance. Humanity, as a non-member, was not on the contact list. The crisis lasted 19 days. 43 people died. I have no way of knowing whether the outcome would have been different if we'd been there. That's a hypothetical I don't want to construct, because constructed hypotheticals serve the person building them more than the truth. What I know is that our medical teams had worked the Sarathi plague response. That Dr. Adanya and people like her had developed protocols for cross-species biological emergencies. That the relay equipment in the Outer Seven had been designed by engineers who understood the specific atmospheric chemistry interactions in those systems, because they'd lived in those systems for years. What I know is that 43 people died. What I know is that the hegemony submitted a request to the Terran government through a back channel 6 days into the crisis, asking whether Earth had personnel with relevant expertise who might be willing to consult on a volunteer basis. The Terran government's response was drafted by a team of diplomats who had spent 18 months being very careful about what they said and how they said it. The response said that Earth was willing to provide humanitarian assistance and would dispatch a medical consultation team, operating under Earth's own authority, not the Assembly's jurisdiction. The terms were accepted in under 2 hours. Dr. Adanya led the consultation team. I know this because I was on the transport, not as anything official, just as someone who had been watching and felt like this was a moment that needed a witness. She gave me a look when she saw me bored that said she knew exactly what I was doing and had decided to allow it. The team was 8 people. Medical specialists, 1 engineer, 1 atmospheric chemist, no weapons, no security detachment, no diplomatic infrastructure. They arrived at the outer boundary of the Kethvar system on day 12 of the crisis, docked with the hegemony's crisis command vessel, and got to work. I stayed out of the way and watched. What happened over the following 7 days is the kind of thing I find difficult to describe without sounding like I'm constructing a myth, and I am trying very hard not to construct a myth here. I'm trying to tell you what I saw. What I saw was this: 8 people who were exceptionally good at their jobs, working in a situation that was genuinely difficult, without drama or performance, doing what needed to be done. They identified the atmospheric interaction mechanism on day 2. They modified the treatment protocol on day 3. By day 5, the spread was contained. By day 7, they developed a remediation procedure for the relay equipment. 43 people had died before they arrived. Nobody died after. The Hegemony's crisis coordination officer, not Varkaseth, a different official, one I hadn't met, sought out Dr. Adanya on day 6 in the medical section of the command vessel while she was running diagnostics on a piece of equipment that didn't belong to her. I was in the corner, doing what I do. The official was a species called the Marev, squat, dense, communicating partly through subsonic vibration that you feel more than hear. It stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed it. She looked up. It said in translated assembly standard, "Your team's work has been beyond our initial expectations." She looked at it for a second. Then she said, "People were dying, we came to help, that's it. We were not certain you would come." She set down the diagnostic tool. "We've always come," she said, with a precision that I felt like a small, careful blade. "When it mattered, we always came." The Marev official was quiet for a while. "Yes," it finally said, "I understand that now." The formal request for humanity's return to the assembly came 8 months after the Kethvar crisis. It didn't come from the hegemony of Vor directly. It came from a coalition of 9 blocs, including 4 who had voted yes on the Murak Exclusion Act. It came with a proposed revision to the member status protocols, eliminating the category of provisional member entirely. It came with a proposed restoration of the outer 7 stations to Terran operational management. And it came with something nobody had expected: a proposed revision to the Murak status, restoring their full representation. Not everything they'd lost, not immediately. The territorial claim was still contested and would remain contested for a long time, but the restrictions on their representation, the 30-year penalty that had been the real wound, those were proposed to be lifted. I don't know whether the Kethvar crisis caused this or whether it was already in motion. These things are never one cause, they're accumulations. But I think the crisis was the moment when some of the people who'd voted yes on the Exclusion Act, and yes on the complaint against humanity, and yes on all the procedural mechanisms that had been used as elegant, civilized weapons. I think that was the moment when some of them understood something. That you can be very skilled at procedure and still be wrong. That the species that builds the relay stations in the systems nobody else wants to go to is not the species you want to push out. That there is a cost to deciding, repeatedly and systematically, that principles are inconvenient. I don't know what the assembly ultimately decided, because the process was ongoing when I finished the last major draft of this account. I know the vote was scheduled. I know the coalition of 9 was working on the proposal. I know that several things could still go wrong. But I also know that Yara Osimensa, who had gone home and taken a different posting, received a message from Vale Soth 3 days after the proposal was announced. She forwarded it to me with no commentary. It said, "The silence was, as you predicted, very loud. The galaxy is remembering now. We hope you are well. Here's the thing about humans that I've spent 4 years and a withdrawal and a crisis and several months of writing trying to articulate. We are not, as a species, particularly graceful. We are not patient in the way that 400-year-old civilizations are patient. We are loud and inconsistent, and we care about things that are not our problem, and we have a persistent, somewhat exhausting tendency to show up. We show up when we're wanted, and we show up when we're not, and we show up when someone tells us not to bother, and we are, categorically, difficult to stop once we've decided something matters. And we walked away. When walking away was the right thing, we did it. Quietly. Correctly. With our forms filled out in the right order and our equipment cataloged and our people looked after, and a single, precise statement that said everything by saying almost nothing. And the silence afterward was ours. We made it, we chose it. And eventually, as Yara had said, the silence got loud. I think about that sometimes. About what it means to be a species young enough to still believe in things and old enough to understand when those things aren't being honored. About what it means to leave not in anger, but in clarity. About what it means to come back, not because you need to, but because someone else does. About what it means when an entity that has existed for centuries, that has spent those centuries perfecting the art of knowing which problems to care about, stands in a medical bay and says, I understand that now. I don't know if the Galactic Assembly will be better for our absence. I don't know if it will be better for our return, if that's what happens. These things take time, and I am 34 years old, and time in this context means centuries that I will not live to see. But I know what I watched. I know that 22 soldiers and 3 specialists and a chess champion medic walked through a station that had made itself very clear about how much it valued them, and they walked in silence, and their silence said more than any speech. I know that 43 people died in a crisis that might have ended differently. I know that a Murak ambassador stood in a departure bay and said this will be remembered even when it is inconvenient to remember. And I know that one of the most powerful blocks in galactic civilization spent 18 months with humanity absent, and then sent a message through back channels, not because it was required to, not because of protocol, but because something was happening that it didn't know how to fix without us. That's the story. Not the version where we're heroes and the galaxy is villains, because it wasn't that clean. Not the version where everything was resolved neatly, because it wasn't. Just the version where a species too young to have learned which things not to care about cared anyway, and it cost us, and we bore the cost, and the cost turned out to matter. The last thing I wrote in my observer log before I closed it out was not for the record. It was for me. I've never read it back until now. It said, the stars look the same from the other side of the decision. Cold, indifferent, beautiful, but something is different. I think it's me. I think it's always been us.